My name is Richard Calloway. I am 70 years old, and until 4 weeks ago, I thought I had raised a son who still remembered how to love his father. But now I stood outside his house in the cool of a Sunday morning, pressing the doorbell over and over. No answer. I called his name. Nothing. I dialed his phone, and again, silence. Finally, with a weight in my chest I could hardly bear, I leaned against the window to see if he was inside. What I saw on the other side made my legs weaken. Plates piled high, curtains drawn, and my son sprawled on the couch, unshaven, a dozen beer bottles surrounding him like soldiers of defeat. For 4 weeks, he had ignored me, after just one small argument. Now he looked like a stranger drowning in his own world, and I could barely breathe. My first thought was that maybe he was dead. My hand shook as I tapped the window. No response. I knocked harder, calling his name. David! David, it's Dad. But he didn't stir. His chest rose and fell shallow, and only then did I know he was alive. Relief was quickly replaced by a heavier sorrow. How had we come to this? One small fight about me reminding him to visit his mother's grave, and he had cut me off completely. For a month, not a single call, not even a text. Now, seeing him like this, I wondered if the son I once knew was gone forever. David had always been proud, but now his pride looked more like cruelty. In our last conversation, he told me, "Dad, you don't understand my life. Stop calling me like you own me." Those words had stuck to my heart like knives. I gave everything I had to raise him, sacrificed years of my own happiness, and yet here I was, treated like a burden, a nuisance, someone better ignored than respected. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of his window, whispering to myself, "How could you do this to me, son?" A neighbor from across the street spotted me and shook her head. Mrs. Green, a widow my age, called out, "Richard, is everything all right?" Her tone carried pity, the kind that burns worse than open insult. I forced a smile, pretending everything was fine. The last thing I wanted was for the neighborhood to know that my own flesh and blood had locked me out, cut me off, and left me standing like a beggar at his doorstep. Behind my smile, though, my stomach twisted with humiliation. My son had turned me into a spectacle. I thought back to when David was little, how he used to grab my hand and say, "Dad, promise you'll never leave me." I had kept that promise every day of his life. Yet now, it was he who had left me. I wanted to break down right there on the porch, but pride held me upright. The shame of an old man weeping in public felt worse than the ache in my chest. I swallowed the pain and stayed silent, though inside my mind, every memory of sacrifice replayed like a cruel movie. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a moment, my heart leapt. Maybe it was David finally calling me back. But it was only an alert from my bank. A payment cleared for his rent, the one I had quietly set to auto-pay years ago, long before he married. Even now, while he ignored me, I was still covering his roof. That was the irony. He locked me out of his life, yet I was the invisible hand keeping him afloat. Rage sparked in me for the first time. How dare he abandon me when I never abandoned him? I raised my fist and pounded harder on the window. "David! Wake up, for God's sake!" His body twitched, and finally, he rolled over, eyes bloodshot, glaring at me as though I were the enemy. He stumbled to his feet, staggered to the door, but instead of unlocking it, he shouted through the wood, "Go home, Dad! I don't want to see you right now." His voice was thick with alcohol, but the cruelty in his tone was clear. He wasn't just avoiding me, he wanted me gone. The words pierced me deeper than he could ever know. The world blurred around me. I had lived 70 years, worked double shifts, buried a wife, built a family, and this was my reward? To be told by my only son, the boy I carried on my shoulders, that I was no longer wanted? My fists loosened, my strength drained. I stepped back, staring at the locked door that separated me from my own blood. It felt like a coffin lid closing. My body trembled, but inside, something stirred, a spark I hadn't felt in years. A reminder of who I used to be before life wore me down. I whispered through the crack in the door, my voice low but steady, "David, you have no idea what you're doing." He scoffed from inside, muttering something I couldn't catch, and then silence again. I straightened my back, wiped the sweat from my palms, and forced myself to breathe. He thought he could erase me, lock me out, and leave me standing in the cold. But he didn't know the truth about who I really was, or what I was capable of. The son I raised might have forgotten me, but I hadn't forgotten myself. As I turned and walked away from that house, my heart heavy but my mind sharper than it had been in years, I realized something. David believed I was just an old man with nothing left to give, nothing left to fight for. But what he didn't know was that I had lived a life full of secrets, sacrifices and choices that had given me power he could not imagine. And now, for the first time in decades, I felt that power return. David had no idea who he was really dealing with. I walked slowly back to my car, every step heavy with memories I couldn't escape. My son thought I was just a tired old man. He didn't know the years of sacrifice buried inside me. As I sat behind the wheel, I closed my eyes, and it all came rushing back. My first job at the steel plant when I was only 16, my hands blistered and lungs burning, working double shifts so my parents didn't lose the house. I learned early that survival wasn't about comfort. It was about grinding your bones down until the people you loved could stand on them. That lesson never left me. Everything I did, every dollar I earned, I gave away so that my family would never suffer the way I had. When I married Linda, my late wife, I swore she would never want for anything. She was gentle, with a smile that could stop time, and she believed in me when no one else did. We built our life from nothing. I worked nights at the plant, then took side jobs fixing cars and hauling lumber. Every extra cent went into savings. I remember her sitting at the kitchen table, balancing our books with a pencil behind her ear, telling me, "Richard, one day all this sacrifice will mean something." She was right. Within 20 years, I had enough saved to start my own construction business. We built houses for people who were just like us, families chasing the American dream. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it gave us a foundation. David was born in those years of struggle. I still remember holding him for the first time, so small, so fragile. Linda whispered in my ear, "Promise me you'll be the father he can always depend on." I promised, and I meant it. When he was 5, I sold my prized Mustang just to pay for his preschool tuition. When he was 10, I gave up a huge business contract because it would have taken me away from home for months. At 16, when he wanted to play baseball, I bought him the best gear even though it meant I wore the same pair of shoes for 2 more years. I thought these sacrifices were invisible to him, but children never notice the cost. They only see what they receive. That was my first mistake, thinking love alone was enough to make him understand. People never knew the truth about my finances. To most, I was just a hard-working man who retired with a modest pension. But what no one knew, not even David, was that the sacrifices Linda and I made had grown into something bigger. We invested carefully. Stocks, land, even some quiet partnerships with local businesses. By the time I turned 65, my quiet fortune was more than enough to secure our family for generations. Linda begged me to keep it a secret, not because she didn't trust David, but because she wanted him to learn the value of work, the way we had. "Let him live like we did," she said. "One day, when he's ready, he'll understand how much we've done for him." I listened. I kept it hidden. When Linda passed, everything changed. The house felt colder, quieter, and my days dragged like shadows. David was there at first. He hugged me, cooked me dinner a few times, checked in like a good son should. But as months turned to years, his visits slowed, his calls grew shorter, and soon he was too busy with his own life. I didn't complain. I told myself it was normal. Children grow up. They chase their own dreams. But still, I was always there, paying his bills silently, helping him with small loans he never repaid, fixing things at his house when he didn't even notice. I kept my promise to Linda, but deep down, I wondered if my son even saw me anymore. The truth was, David had always struggled with pride. He didn't like being told what to do. Even as a teenager, he'd say, "Dad, let me live my own life." I gave him space, but I also knew the world wasn't kind to the unprepared. I tried to guide him, sometimes too firmly, I admit. Our last argument was proof of that. I only asked him to take his kids to their mother's grave, to honor the woman who gave him everything. But he snapped, accused me of controlling him, and that was it. Weeks of silence. Now I sat in my car outside his house, remembering every sleepless night I spent working for his future, and I wondered if all those years meant nothing to him. What David didn't know was that I still carried Linda's last words in my heart. On her final night, weak and breathless, she grabbed my hand and whispered, "Don't let him forget who you are. Don't let him forget what you did for him." I promised her. At the time, I thought it meant being patient, waiting for him to realize it on his own. But maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it meant I had to remind him in a way he would never forget. Sitting there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, I realized patience had gotten me nowhere. If Linda were alive, she would never forgive me for letting our son treat me like a shadow. I looked at the reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair was gray, my face lined with years of labor and sorrow, but behind my eyes there was still a fire. I wasn't just some old man begging for scraps of attention. I was Richard Calloway, the man who built an empire out of sweat and sacrifice. I had connections in the town, people who owed me favors, men who remembered how I helped them when no one else would. I wasn't powerless. I had simply forgotten what power felt like. And now, as my own son turned his back on me, I knew it was time to remember. But even as determination filled me, guilt sat heavy in my chest. I didn't want to hurt David. I didn't want revenge. I only wanted him to see me again, to recognize the father who had carried him his whole life. Still, if it took a storm to wake him, then I was ready to bring the storm. I would not be erased. I would not be locked out of his life like an unwanted guest. I would show him the truth, not just about my sacrifices, but about who I had always been beneath the quiet exterior. As I turned the ignition and drove away, the road stretched before me like a long-forgotten battlefield. Every mile carried me deeper into my own memories. I thought about the men I had helped rise to success, the businesses I had invested in quietly, the land I had purchased that was now worth millions. I had hidden my strength for decades, but maybe it was time to use it. David had no idea the kind of man he was ignoring. He thought I was weak, but weakness was never part of my story. What he didn't know was that my years of sacrifice were about to be tested in ways neither of us could have imagined. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. I thought David's silence was temporary, but it grew louder with every passing day. I left voicemails he never returned, sent text messages that went unanswered. At first, I excused it. Maybe he was busy with work, maybe the kids needed him. But then I learned from a mutual friend that David had been telling people I was overbearing and stuck in the past. Hearing that broke something inside me. I wasn't just being ignored, I was being painted as the villain in a story where all I had ever done was give. Every word he spoke behind my back was a nail in the coffin of the father I once believed I was to him. It wasn't just David who turned cold. His wife, Jenna, began keeping me at arm's length. She stopped inviting me to family dinners, claiming they were too tired or too busy. On Christmas Eve, I showed up with gifts for the grandchildren, only to find the house dark and empty. Later, I saw on social media that they had gone to her parents' home instead. No call, no explanation. I sat alone that night with presents unopened under my tree, the silence of the house suffocating me. For 70 years I had been surrounded by noise, machines at work, children laughing, Linda humming while she cooked, but now there was nothing. Just the echo of abandonment. What made it worse was the way David started twisting the story. He told Jenna's family that I was manipulative, that I tried to control him even as an adult. He said I threatened to cut him off financially, though the truth was I never once mentioned the money I gave him. In fact, he didn't even know how much I had done for him behind the scenes. Still, his words spread. People I had known for decades began looking at me differently, as if I were some bitter old man trying to cling to relevance. The humiliation was unbearable. It was one thing to lose my son, but another to lose the respect of the community I had built my life in. Despite the disrespect, I kept giving. I paid his overdue car insurance, I covered a hospital bill for Jenna without telling her, and I even slipped money into an account for the children's school supplies. I thought maybe if I just kept helping, they would eventually remember who I was to them. But it didn't matter. The more I gave, the more they seemed to resent me. It was as if every act of kindness became another excuse for them to accuse me of interference. I began to realize that no matter how much I sacrificed, they would always twist it into something ugly. There were moments when I caught glimpses of loyalty from others. My neighbor Mrs. Green often brought me meals and reminded me that I was not invisible. My brother-in-law, Walter, called once in a while to say he still respected me, that Linda would be proud. And there was my granddaughter, Emily, only 12 years old, who once whispered to me during a rare visit, "Grandpa, I miss you." That single sentence gave me enough strength to keep standing. But those flickers of light were quickly swallowed by the darkness of David's bitterness. It was as though he wanted me erased from his life entirely. The more isolated I became, the clearer the pattern grew. David wasn't just angry, he was rewriting history. Every sacrifice I made was forgotten, every lesson I tried to teach twisted into cruelty. Jenna encouraged it, feeding his resentment. She once told me outright, "Richard, maybe it's time you stop interfering and let David live his life without you." Her tone was polite, but her eyes were sharp, like she enjoyed cutting me out. The betrayal burned. I had treated her like a daughter, welcomed her into the family with open arms, and now she was turning my son against me. Friends began asking why they never saw me with David anymore. Each question was a dagger. I smiled, made excuses, but inside I was crumbling. I had built my entire identity around being a father and a provider. Without that, who was I? Just another forgotten old man in a quiet house, waiting for a phone call that never came. Loneliness became my constant companion, whispering that maybe my life had lost its meaning. But then I would hear Linda's voice in my mind, reminding me, "Don't let him forget who you are." And I knew I couldn't give up, not yet. The final straw came one Sunday morning when I drove past David's house and saw a gathering in his yard. Balloons, laughter, children playing, it was Emily's birthday party. I hadn't been invited. I pulled over down the street, watching from a distance as my own family celebrated without me. My granddaughter blew out candles while I sat alone in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I wasn't just excluded, I was erased. That day, I swore to myself that I would no longer sit quietly while my son disrespected me. I would no longer be their doormat. As I drove home from that painful scene, something inside me shifted. The sorrow that had weighed me down for weeks transformed into resolve. If David wanted to treat me like I was nothing, then it was time to remind him that I was not a man to be dismissed. I had lived through too much, sacrificed too much, to vanish quietly into the shadows of his life. The years of patience were over. The man who built an empire of sweat and sacrifice was still alive, and he was ready to show his son exactly who he had been ignoring. From that day forward, I stopped begging for attention. I stopped calling and waiting for scraps of affection. Instead, I began to prepare. The same way I once built businesses and secured my family's future, I would now build a plan. I wasn't going to fight with words anymore. I was going to use the resources, connections, and wisdom that decades of sacrifice had given me. For the first time in years, I felt alive again. David had made one mistake too many. And now, it was time for me to remind him who he was really dealing with. I woke up the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The humiliation, the loneliness, the betrayal, they had all carved something sharp inside me. I was done being ignored. My son thought I was powerless, just an old man waiting for the end. He didn't know that behind my quiet life was a network of people who still owed me favors, a hidden map of connections I had built over decades. As I poured myself a black coffee, I opened the old notebook I kept locked away in my desk drawer. Inside were names, numbers, and small details I had recorded over the years. People I helped get their first jobs, business owners I had lent money to, friends who had promised me, "Richard, if you ever need anything, you just call." It was time to test those promises. The first call I made was to Walter, my late wife's brother. Walter was blunt and sometimes difficult, but he respected me. "Richard," he said, his voice low, "I hate what David's been doing. Jenna has her hooks in him, always whispering poison. But listen, I hear things. You want to know the truth? They're drowning in debt. Maxed out credit cards, overdue mortgage payments. Jenna spends faster than David earns, and he's too proud to ask for help." My heart sank. So that was why he resented me, because deep down, he knew I was still paying for his safety net. Walter gave me names of banks, even mentioned a car loan that was 6 months behind. I thanked him, my hands trembling not with weakness this time, but with purpose. That night, I drove downtown to visit an old friend named Carl, a banker I had once helped during a tough season. He owed me more than one favor. Over dinner at a quiet steakhouse, I asked him to discreetly check into David's accounts. Carl leaned back in his chair, sighing. "Richard, I'll be honest with you. Your son's a financial mess. Gambling debts, payday loans, even some shady online poker transactions. He's trying to keep up appearances, but he's hanging on by threads." I felt anger rise in me, not because David was struggling, but because he had shut me out while secretly living off the very stability I provided. He didn't just disrespect me, he was hiding the truth from his own children. The deeper I dug, the uglier it became. Jenna wasn't innocent either. Through another contact, an old contractor friend who now worked security, I learned she had been seen at the casino more than once, always leaving late at night, sometimes not alone. The whispers suggested she wasn't just addicted to shopping but also to thrills she didn't want David to know about. Suddenly, the pieces began to fit. Her bitterness toward me, her need to keep me at a distance, it was because she was afraid I'd discover the truth. She wanted to paint me as controlling so she could hide her own secrets in the shadows. Despite the betrayal, I wasn't quick to judge. I knew what desperation looked like. I had seen men fall into bad habits when they felt cornered. But what cut me deeply was that instead of coming to me, instead of trusting the father who had always sacrificed for him, David chose to push me away and paint me as the enemy. He would rather let his family drown than accept my hand. And that I could not forgive, not yet. I was no stranger to hardship, but I had always faced it head-on. My son was running from his, and dragging me through the mud to cover his tracks. I didn't work alone. I called in favors from old business partners, men who still remembered when I had saved their companies with quiet investments. They confirmed what I already suspected. David's name had come up more than once, usually in connection with late payments and broken promises. "He's burning bridges fast, Richard," one man told me. "Soon he won't have anywhere left to turn." I nodded silently, feeling both sorrow and grim satisfaction. My son had built his life on the foundation of my sacrifices, but instead of standing tall, he was digging himself into a pit. And when he finally looked up, he wouldn't even recognize the man who held the rope. All the while, I kept my eyes open at home. I watched the neighborhood, listened to the whispers. People talked more than they realized. Mrs. Green mentioned one afternoon that she had seen David's car parked at a rundown bar on the edge of town. Another neighbor let slip that Jenna had been coming home late in rideshare cars, never with groceries or bags, just silence and avoidance. Each piece of information was a thread, and slowly I was weaving together a picture they had tried so hard to keep hidden from me. The same son who told me to mind my own business was living in chaos that he couldn't control. I was careful not to let my anger blind me. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. David had made me out to be weak, irrelevant, a burden. But I had the power to expose his lies and to remind him who I was. I wasn't going to scream or pound on his door again. No. I was going to use patience and precision, just like I had in business. I was going to wait for the moment when the weight of his secrets would come crashing down, and I would be standing there, calm and unshaken, to remind him of the father he tried to erase. At night, when the house was quiet and the loneliness pressed down, I would think of Linda. I imagined her sitting across from me, her voice gentle but firm. "Richard, you've given enough. Now it's time for them to learn." I clung to those words, even if they were just my memory of her. She had always been my compass, and even in death, she guided me. I realized then that this wasn't just about David. It was about the legacy of my sacrifices. If he refused to see the truth, then I would have to show him in a way he could not deny. By the end of the month, I had everything I needed. Bank records, whispered rumors, undeniable evidence of the life David and Jenna were hiding. Armed with this knowledge, I no longer felt powerless. I felt like the man I had been in my prime, strategic, steady, dangerous in silence. My son believed he could erase me, but he had no idea that the man standing in the shadows was the same one who built everything he took for granted. And soon, he was going to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. The plan began quietly, like the first stones laid for a foundation. I knew from years of experience that power wasn't about shouting or forcing, it was about patience. Let your opponent believe they are winning, let them grow arrogant, and then pull the ground out from under their feet. That was how I built my business, and that was how I would handle David and Jenna. They thought I was powerless, irrelevant, just a father too old to matter. But I had gathered their secrets, and secrets are heavier than gold. If handled right, they can crush the people who carry them. I was ready to build the trap, one careful piece at a time. The first step was money. I quietly shut off the automatic payments I had been covering for David's bills, his rent, his car, his insurance. 4 years, those payments had been invisible, like oxygen. Now, without them, he would begin to suffocate. I knew it wouldn't be immediate. It would take a week, maybe 2, before the overdue notices arrived in his mailbox. But when they did, he would feel the walls closing in. I smiled bitterly to myself as I pictured him scratching his head, wondering why the world suddenly seemed heavier. He had no idea the quiet hands that carried him had finally been withdrawn. Next, I made sure the right people knew the truth. I didn't gossip. I never needed to. Instead, I planted seeds. Over coffee with Mrs. Green, I casually mentioned that I worried about David's gambling. With Walter, I sighed about Jenna's late nights. I knew how small towns worked. Whispers traveled faster than fire, and soon they would circle back to the people they were about. I didn't need to accuse or argue. I only needed to let others connect the dots, and they would. When the day came, David wouldn't just face me, he would face a community that no longer believed his lies. I also reached out to allies who still respected me. Carl at the bank agreed to delay certain notices by a few days, just long enough for me to time my moves perfectly. An old lawyer friend reviewed my records and confirmed that, legally, David had no claim to the wealth I had hidden. If push came to shove, I could cut him off entirely and still protect the grandchildren. That knowledge steadied me. This wasn't about destroying my son, it was about protecting the legacy Linda and I built. If David wanted to burn himself, fine. But I wouldn't let him burn everything we had sacrificed for. While the trap tightened, I maintained my silence with David. I didn't call, didn't knock, didn't beg. That silence was its own weapon. The absence of my voice would unsettle him. For the first time, he would have to live without the safety net he didn't even know he had. And when the bills came due, when Jenna's excuses ran out, when the whispers caught up with them, he would look around for someone to blame. That's when I would be waiting. Not as the weak, rejected father, but as the man he forgot I was, the man who could lift him up or let him fall. The hardest part was waiting. Days stretched long in my empty house. At night, I replayed memories of better times. David as a boy, running across the yard with scraped knees, Linda laughing from the porch. My heart ached for the family I once had. But every ache hardened into resolve. I reminded myself of the birthday party I wasn't invited to, the locked door, the words he shouted through the wood, "Go home, Dad!" Those wounds became fuel. I wasn't just setting a trap for revenge. I was setting a stage to remind him that a father's sacrifice is not something to be mocked or forgotten. And yet, I gave him one last chance. A mercy. One evening, I wrote a letter by hand, my words simple and clear. "David, I don't want to fight. I only want respect. Your mother would want us to stand together, not apart. I love you, but I will not be ignored. Think carefully about the path you are on." I sealed it and mailed it, knowing full well he might tear it up without reading. But if there was even a sliver of conscience left in him, this was his opportunity to change course. To step back before the storm hit. He never replied. Meanwhile, Jenna's arrogance grew. I saw her once at the grocery store, dressed in expensive clothes she couldn't afford, talking loudly about a trip she was planning. When she spotted me, her smile was sharp, cruel. "Richard," she said, "it's been a while. Maybe it's best we all keep some space, don't you think?" Her tone was laced with victory, as if she had already erased me from the family. I nodded politely, but inside I almost laughed. She had no idea how close the ground beneath her feet was to giving way. Pride makes people blind. And she was blinder than anyone I'd ever known. The trap was nearly complete. I had the knowledge, the timing, the allies. The silence was working, the cracks in their life beginning to show. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment, one that would hurt enough to wake David from his arrogance but not destroy him completely. Because despite everything, he was still my son. I didn't want to ruin him. I only wanted him to remember who I was, who I had always been. The man who gave him life, who carried him on his shoulders, who buried his mother alone. That man deserved respect. As I sat in my quiet living room one evening, the sun setting through the window, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The pieces were in place, and the storm was coming. David thought he had won, that he had pushed me out for good. But the truth was, the silence was only the calm before the thunder. The next day would change everything. David and Jenna were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives, and when they did, they would finally see me for who I really was. The morning came sooner than I expected. I was sitting at my kitchen table when the phone rang. It wasn't David, it was Carl from the bank. "Richard," he said carefully, "your son is here. He looks shaken. His accounts are frozen, and the bank won't extend any more credit. He's demanding answers." I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. The trap had sprung. The invisible hands that carried him were gone, and now the weight of his choices pressed fully against him. It was time. I told Carl, "Let him sit. I'll be there in 20 minutes. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with a steady rhythm of purpose. For the first time in years, I was walking into battle not as a victim, but as a man who remembered his power. When I arrived, David was pacing in the lobby, his face pale, eyes frantic. The moment he saw me, his expression twisted with anger. "You," he spat. "Did you have something to do with this? My cards are useless. The bank says I'm overdrawn. What the hell did you do, Dad?" His voice was loud enough to draw stares from the other customers. Once that might have humiliated me. Today I stood tall, meeting his glare with steady eyes. "No, David," I said calmly. "This is what happens when you live on borrowed time. The truth always comes due." His anger faltered for a split second, confusion flickering in his eyes. For the first time, he realized I wasn't here to beg. I was here to command. We stepped into Carl's office, the door closing behind us. David leaned against the desk, his hands trembling. "Why are you doing this to me? You're supposed to be my father." I let the words hang in the air before replying, "And I was your father. For 70 years, I gave you everything. I worked my hands to the bone, I paid your bills, I kept your roof standing. Even when you ignored me, I carried you. But you threw me out of your life like trash. You locked the door on me, David. And now, you're discovering just how much of your life depended on the man you cast aside." His face reddened, his jaw tightening, but he had no words. He couldn't deny it. He knew it was true. Jenna burst into the office minutes later, her perfume heavy, her eyes sharp. "What is going on here?" she demanded, glaring at me as though I were the intruder. "Richard, you've meddled enough. Leave us alone." I turned to her slowly, my voice low but steady. "No, Jenna. I won't leave. Not this time. You've poisoned my son against me, convinced him I'm some relic from the past. But I know your secrets. The casino trips, the debts, the late nights you never explained. You thought I wasn't watching. You thought I was too old to notice. But I see you. And I see the damage you've done." For the first time, her confidence cracked. Her lips parted, but no words came. David looked at her, stunned, and I knew the truth had begun to take root. The confrontation escalated. David slammed his hand on the desk. "You've been spying on me? On us?" His voice shook, not with strength, but with fear. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "No, David. I didn't need to spy. The world tells its own story if you listen. Your debts, your late payments, your lies, they shouted louder than I ever could. And while you were too proud to come to me, I was the one keeping you afloat. Every bill paid, every debt delayed, every time you thought you made it through, it was me. Your father. The man you told to go home." His shoulders slumped as if the weight of every word pressed down on him. The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Jenna tried to recover, her voice sharp. "Even if that's true, Richard, this doesn't give you the right to control our lives." I turned to her, my voice cutting through her defiance like a blade. "Control? I never wanted control. I wanted respect. I wanted acknowledgement of the years I gave so that you and your children could live in comfort. But since you both refuse to see that, I'll make it clear. I have the power to pull every string you depend on. Your home, your car, your reputation, it all traces back to me. You thought I was powerless. You were wrong." Her face paled, and for the first time, she looked away. Power is not in shouting. It's in the silence that follows when truth can't be denied. The witnesses mattered. Carl, the banker, sat quietly in the corner, watching. He knew the truth, and so did the staff who peeked in through the glass door. The story would spread quickly, not because I forced it, but because the sight of an old man standing tall while his son crumbled was unforgettable. I wasn't just confronting David and Jenna, I was reminding the entire town who I really was. The man they had pitied was not weak. The father they ignored was not invisible. Every eye in that room bore witness to the shift in power, and I let the silence linger long enough for it to take root. David sank into the chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't realize you were still helping me. I thought you were just trying to control me." His words carried regret, but also shame. For a moment, my heart softened. He was still my son, still the boy I carried on my shoulders, even if buried under years of pride and arrogance. But I couldn't let mercy erase the lesson. "You didn't want to know, David," I said firmly. "Because knowing would mean admitting that you needed me. And you couldn't do that. Not until now." The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with silence. Jenna sat frozen, her mask shattered. David wept quietly, his pride broken. I stood, placing my hand on the desk, my voice steady as stone. "This is only the beginning. For years, you disrespected me, ignored me, erased me. That ends today. I will not be your doormat anymore. I will not be your silent benefactor. From this day forward, you will remember who I am, and you will treat me accordingly. Because if you don't, you will lose everything you've taken for granted." My words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. As I left the bank, the crisp air filled my lungs, and I felt lighter than I had in decades. I had stood tall, I had spoken the truth, and I had reminded them of the man they had forgotten. But deep inside, I knew this was not the end. This confrontation was only the spark. There were still years of disrespect to address, still debts, emotional and otherwise, that needed settling. I walked to my car with my head held high, knowing that the reckoning was just beginning. And when it came, no one in my family would ever forget it. Word spread faster than I imagined. By the next Sunday, whispers had traveled across town, from the diner booths to the church pews. "Did you hear what happened at the bank?" people murmured. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others nodded with quiet satisfaction. The story painted me not as a broken old man, but as a father who had finally stood up. That morning, David and Jenna came to my house. Not with flowers or apologies, but with demands. "Dad," David started, his voice tight, "you embarrassed me in front of the whole town. You've turned everyone against us." He looked more like a boy than a man, cornered, angry, afraid. I sat in my chair by the window, calm as the morning light. "No, David," I replied. "You did that yourself. I just let the truth out." His face flushed red, but he couldn't argue. Truth has a way of settling the score. The reckoning stretched beyond my son and his wife. My granddaughter, Emily, who had barely spoken to me in months, showed up that afternoon. Her eyes brimmed with tears. "Grandpa," she whispered, "is it true? Were you the one helping Dad all these years?" I nodded. "Yes, Emily. Every time he said he pulled through, it was me behind the scenes." Her lips trembled, and she shook her head. "He never told us. He made it sound like he did it all himself." I reached out, taking her hand. Sometimes people hide the hands that feed them because they don't want to admit they're hungry. She sat down, her eyes wide with a mix of sorrow and respect. In that moment, I saw a glimmer of the bond one thought was lost. Perhaps not all had turned their hearts to stone. Jenna, however, had no softness in her. She pulled Emily aside, her voice sharp like a whip. "Don't let him fool you. He's just trying to turn you against us." I watched Emily's eyes flicker between us, torn between loyalty and truth. "Mom," she said quietly, "I think he's telling the truth. I've seen the envelopes in the mail, the payments that didn't match Dad's story." Jenna's face twisted with fury. "Enough, Emily. You're too young to understand." But the seed was planted. Jenna could no longer control every narrative. Her mask of perfection was slipping, and everyone could see the cracks. As the days passed, family members began choosing sides. My younger son, Mark, called from out of state. "Dad, I heard what happened," he said with a sigh. "I always suspected David was leaning too hard on you. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." His voice carried regret, but also relief. For the first time, he sounded like the son I remembered, grateful, respectful. "It's never too late to do right," I told him. "What matters is what you do now." That conversation reminded me that not all my sacrifices had fallen on deaf ears. Some seeds had taken root, even if hidden beneath years of silence. The reckoning wasn't just about exposing lies, it was about revealing character. Friends I hadn't heard from in years stopped by, patting my back, shaking my hand. "About time, Richard," one old co-worker chuckled. "You've carried those kids long enough." Their words weren't just comfort, they were validation. The world was watching, and for once, they weren't pitying me. They were respecting me. And that, I realized, was worth more than any inheritance or bank account. Respect was the currency of a life well lived, and finally, mine was paying dividends. David grew more desperate. One evening, he stood on my porch, rain dripping from his hair. His voice cracked as he pleaded, "Dad, please, I need your help. The creditors are closing in. Jenna's threatening to leave if I can't fix this." His eyes searched mine, looking for the same old softness, the same open door. My heart twisted. He was still my son. But I couldn't let mercy erase the lesson. "David," I said firmly, "I will always love you. But I will not save you from the choices you made. Respect isn't free. You have to earn it. And until you do, you'll have to face this storm on your own." His shoulders slumped, and for once, he didn't argue. He turned and walked into the rain, smaller than I had ever seen him. It was Emily who brought the family together for the final reckoning. She called for a dinner, inviting everyone. Me, David, Jenna, her younger siblings, even Mark. "We need to talk as a family," she insisted. Reluctantly, they came. Around the table, the tension was thick. Plates clinked, forks scraped, but silence held us hostage. Finally, Emily broke it. "I think we've all been blind," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "Grandpa has been holding this family together for years, and we treated him like he was a burden. That stops now." Her courage filled the room. I watched David's face as shame washed over him. Jenna's eyes narrowed, but she couldn't silence her daughter. The truth had been spoken by the very generation they thought would ignore it. At that dinner, the walls crumbled. Mark admitted he should have been around more. Emily confessed she felt ashamed for believing her father's lies. Even David, through clenched teeth, muttered, "I was wrong." Jenna remained silent, her pride too thick to break, but her silence spoke volumes. The reckoning was complete. Every mask had been ripped away, every lie exposed. What remained was raw, painful, but honest. For the first time in years, the family looked at me not as an old man in the corner, but as the foundation they had ignored. As the dust settled, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. I hadn't wanted this war, but it had been necessary. Sometimes the only way to rebuild is to burn down the house of lies. And as I sat at that table, surrounded by faces both repentant and defiant, I knew one thing for certain: they would never look at me the same way again. Respect had been restored, not by begging, not by sacrifice, but by truth. And that truth would echo in this family for generations to come. As the evening ended and everyone filed out, I remained at the table, staring at the candle's dying flame. I whispered to myself, "Lesson learned." But deep inside, I knew this was not the end. Redemption was still possible, for David, for Emily, perhaps even for Jenna. But they would have to earn it. I had given them the reckoning. Now it was up to them to live with it. The weeks after the reckoning were strangely quiet. My phone, once silent from neglect, now rang with hesitant calls. Mark checked in every few days. Emily stopped by with groceries, saying, "Grandpa, you shouldn't be lifting heavy bags anymore." Even David began showing up, not with demands, but with silence. He'd sit across from me on the porch, eyes on the horizon, words stuck in his throat. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. And in that silence, I found a strange comfort. Sometimes change doesn't come with speeches. Sometimes it comes with presence, with the simple act of showing up. The town's view of me shifted as well. At church, people no longer patted my shoulder in pity, they shook my hand with respect. Neighbors stopped to wave, their eyes carrying a quiet admiration. One man at the hardware store even said, "Richard, you gave us all a reminder. Family doesn't mean being a doormat. It means standing for what's right." His words sank deep. For years, I thought sacrifice was silent. But now I understood, sacrifice without respect is slavery. True love has to be paired with boundaries, or it rots into resentment. Emily became my closest ally. She'd sit at my kitchen table, her notebook open, scribbling down my stories. "Grandpa," she said one afternoon, "you've lived through so much. People should hear it. I want my kids to know who you really are, not just the old man Dad always complained about." Her words made my chest tighten. She saw me, truly saw me. For the first time in decades, I wasn't just a background character in my family's play. I was the storyteller, the foundation, the teacher. And Emily, with her wide eyes and sharp mind, was listening. David's journey was harder. He stumbled often, weighed down by his pride. One evening, he finally broke. He stood in my doorway, shoulders hunched, eyes glistening. "Dad," he whispered, "I don't know how to fix everything. I've made a mess of it all." I let him stand there in his shame before answering. "You start by admitting it. Then you do the work. One day at a time." His tears fell silently, and for the first time since he was a boy, he hugged me, not out of habit, but out of need. My arms wrapped around him, and though the wounds were deep, I felt the first threads of healing stitching themselves together. Jenna, on the other hand, chose distance. She blamed me for her crumbling control, for the respect she could no longer demand from her children. But I did not chase her. Some lessons take longer to learn, and some people must walk through fire before they change. I prayed she would find humility, but I no longer made her choices my burden. That was the difference now. I carried my own weight, not the weight of everyone else. And that freedom felt like air in my lungs. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Bills still came, the house still creaked with age, and loneliness still visited on quiet nights. But the loneliness no longer crushed me. Because now, when Emily laughed in my kitchen, or when Mark called just to ask about my garden, I knew my sacrifices had not been wasted. They had simply been hidden, buried under pride and misunderstanding. And now, like seeds in spring, they were breaking through the soil, blooming into something new. One Saturday, Emily organized a family gathering in the backyard. The grill smoked, children ran through the grass, and laughter echoed across the fence. I sat in my old lawn chair, watching as David flipped burgers and Mark told stories. For the first time in years, the family wasn't fractured, it was together. Emily raised her glass and said, "To Grandpa, for teaching us that strength doesn't mean shouting. It means standing tall when no one sees you. It means love with boundaries. We're better because of him." Tears blurred my vision, but I smiled. That moment was worth every heartbreak that came before it. As the sun set, David came to me, a plate of food in his hand. He sat beside me, his voice low. "Dad, I can't change the past. But I want to do better. For you, for Emily, for myself." I looked at him, my son, older now, humbled by life's blows. "Then start today," I said softly. "Every day you choose better, you build a new future. And one day, you'll be the man your daughter already thinks you are." His eyes welled, but he nodded. That nod was a promise, and though fragile, it was enough. As the night wound down and the stars blinked above, I realized something profound. Strength isn't about wealth or secrets. It isn't about control or revenge. True strength is quiet. It's patience, resilience, and love that doesn't crumble under disrespect. It's knowing when to give, and when to stop giving. It's standing tall even when your legs feel weak. And as I looked around at the faces of my family, some still learning, some already changed, I felt peace wash over me. Sometimes the people we think are weakest turn out to be the strongest of all. I had proven that quiet strength can move mountains. And though the years ahead would not be perfect, they would be mine, lived with dignity, respect, and a family that, at last, had begun to understand the worth of the man who held them together all along. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story.